On the face of it, the handshake between Fidel Castro and Ernest Hemingway on May 15, 1960, may have appeared an inconsequential aside amid the period of unprecedented upheaval within Cuban politics. It took place at the 10th annual fishing tournament held at the writer's eponymous marina on the outskirts of Havana, a cheerful, semi-public affair famed for attracting both seasoned sportsmen as well as an illustrious assemblage of authors, ambassadors, and Hollywood glitterati. Himself an avid and accomplished angler, this was just one of many events in Hemingway's adopted homeland to which he had lent his name, becoming so warmly regarded among locals that he was referred to simply as Papa, even while maintaining a careful and well-considered distance from the rapidly shifting tides of the nation's post-revolutionary landscape. Castro's arrival was not wholly unexpected. Known for his habit of introducing himself to, and often imposing himself upon, artists, intellectuals, and other important cultural figures, he arrived in the company of fellow insurgent Che Guevara, likely in pursuit of a photo opportunity that would further legitimize their newly established authority. This duly arrived. El Comandante's conversation with his host, however, was brief and decidedly superficial. Pleasantries, rum, some mutual backslapping, a few words about the intricacies of fishing, and Hemingway's difficulty obtaining boat parts under the US embargo. Yet, in hindsight, so too was it an encounter charged with symbolic weight, marking the point at which a once dominant Anglo-American vision of masculinity, a vision forged in empire, industry, individualism, and stoic self-restraint, began giving way to a more collectivist, ideologically minded Latin ideal. The pair's meeting came at a time when Havana sat suspended between epochs. The gilded facade erected under the ousted Batista regime, an era of lavish hotels, hedonistic cabarets, and all-night casinos, a playground where tourists, mobsters, and international business tycoons mingled against a backdrop of flagrant corruption and grinding inescapable poverty, was fast giving way to a still-to-be-written future. The streets reverberating with socialist slogans and the trudge of military parades, the talk hopeful, yet laced with the anxiety of impending, irreversible change. Hemingway's presence encapsulated this discordance perfectly. His Finca Villa estate endured as a relic of Cuba's more cosmopolitan age, a world of affluence and expatriate ease, sustained by his immense literary successes alongside a highly favourable exchange rate. The 20 years he had spent there, residing with his fourth wife, Mary, their live-in help, some 50 cats, and a revolving door of movie star guests, had been governed by a rigidly self-imposed routine. Mornings spent writing in his office before retiring for breakfast on the terrace. Beer and marlin fishing in the afternoon, followed by evenings of socializing and sugarless daiquiris at his favorite bar, El Floridita. It was, at least on the surface, an idyllic and proudly self-contained existence. A last vestige of the pre-revolutionary order, when a man such as Hemingway could live by his own code, largely untroubled by the meddling hand of the state. Beyond the confines of this private fiefdom, however, an altogether different Cuba was taking shape. Businesses were being nationalized, land redistributed, and foreign assets seized, as the government's infrastructure of control and top-down cultural identity was rigorously and ruthlessly imposed. Promises of libertad and independencia may have still adorned their propaganda posters and rang from their political podiums, but so too were the mechanics of these promises materializing as a progressively despotic reality, Those who had rallied behind Castro's anti-imperialist rhetoric suddenly finding themselves subsumed into his Marxist-Leninist orthodoxy. It might even be said that when the guerrilla-turned-statesman appeared at Hemingway's marina, far from seeking a moment of mere political theatre, much less entry into a fishing contest, he was instead stepping onto a stage that embodied everything he had once endeavoured to transcend, yet one he now fully intended to co-opt as his own. Looking at the photos of Castro and Hemingway together, there would seem little in the novelist's demeanour, ostensibly jovial, to betray the profound suffering that had taken hold of his life. By the time he met the Cuban leader, America's foremost literary icon was besieged by depression, debilitating paranoia, and frequent bouts of literally crippling anxiety. His claims that he was being surveilled by the FBI dismissed as further proof of his delusions, although eventually confirmed true by friend and biographer A.E. Hutchner. Years of heavy drinking had left his body ravaged with hypertension and acute liver sclerosis, while injuries sustained from shrapnel wounds, amateur boxing matches, and countless drunken mishaps had drained his once fabled virility, so central to his myth, until all that remained was near constant pain, merciless self-loathing, and most intolerable of all, creative paralysis. "I can't write anymore," Hemingway told friends after several rounds of electroshock therapy had all but obliterated his memory. "All I do is fuck around." Such decrepitude stood in stark contrast to the archetype he had for so long epitomized. Hemingway, after all, was a man who had hunted big game in Africa, ran with the bulls in Pamplona, survived 2 successive plane crashes, and covered wars from Normandy to Constantinople, drinking hard, writing harder, marrying often, and living life with an unrelenting and ultimately unsustainable intensity. It is not difficult to see why the US, for a time, elevated Hemingway to nothing less than an incarnation of its national vitality. Fresh from victory in World War II, economically unencumbered, and utterly convinced of their moral and civilizational supremacy, citizens recognized in the Nobel laureate's swashbuckling persona the purest distillation of a uniquely American brand of masculinity, bold, brash, romantic, and fiercely uncompromising. Men such as he were celebrated not in spite of their excesses, but rather because of them. The author behind testosterone-fueled classics such as A Farewell to Arms and For Whom the Bell Tolls, typifying the same reckless confidence and unapologetic swagger that characterized the country in the world stage. But as Castro tightened his grip on power, and with his own health faltering, Hemingway's time in Cuba became increasingly untenable. Though he had once enjoyed a kind of unofficial ambassadorial status on the island, the political atmosphere was becoming openly hostile to Americans, particularly those of such wealth and prestige, and upon learning that his property was slated for expropriation, the self-declared Cubano Sato could see no alternative but to begin the reluctant process of returning to the United States. By this point, of course, the country was quite unrecognizable from the one which had produced him. Eroded by the twin pressures of commercialism and suburban domestication, the principles of rugged self-reliance that Hemingway so singularly exemplified had started to devolve into something softer and more commodified. Masculinity no longer shaped by sacrifice, physical danger, or higher callings, but by professional advancement and material accumulation. In this freshly tamed America, the culture that had once lionized the maverick artist, the solitary frontiersman, the captain of industry, and the indomitable soldier was now being supplanted by a society which celebrated those who passively consumed, in effect, trading the man of action for the man of transaction. Castro, by contrast, was very much in his prime. At just 33 years old and an imposing 6'3", he exuded a palpable charisma and hypnotic ferocity, which captivated the masses, not just in Cuba and Latin America, but throughout the global South. In the eyes of many, he had surpassed his role of heroic liberator to become little short of a quasi-messianic icon, a man of the people who, in his trademark olive drab and perpetually dishevelled beard, had toppled the tyrannical Batista regime with only his ragtag band of revolutionaries and a surplus of insurrectionary zeal. By this point, el leader Maximo still hosted American diplomats, played baseball with peasants, shared bottles of rum among dock workers, and enthusiastically championed independence movements across the developing world, projecting both to his detractors and his devotees a powerful synthesis of political savvy and proletarian grit. Rumours about his health continued to circle. Cancer, schizophrenia, syphilis, generally as part of US efforts to undermine his appeal. But in 1960, such reports failed to hold much weight. His image was intoxicating and elemental. His reputation was global, magnetic, and mythic. To what extent this image stemmed from Castro's own temperament, rather than his movement's steadily expanding propaganda apparatus, is all but impossible to say. What is certain, however, is that Cuba's Prime Minister had long sought to cast himself as the living embodiment of Hombre Nuevo, the new socialist man, selfless, disciplined, and above all, ideologically pure. Fundamental to this depiction was his readiness to cloak himself in the nation's deeply rooted veneration of machismo, a trait that, to no small degree, distinguished Latin American communism from its more bureaucratic counterparts in China and the Soviet Union. This was not solely political posturing. Throughout his youth and young adulthood, Fidelito, as he was then known, excelled at virtually every sport he turned his hand to, earning recognition as Havana's outstanding schoolboy athlete. He was a keen huntsman and horseback rider, while during his Jesuit-led education, he was considered an intelligent but disinterested student, his passion for politics igniting only at university, where he would become noted for his fiery speeches and prominent membership in violent left-wing gangs. But while masculinity may always have been an innate feature of Castro's character, in the wake of the 1959 revolution, this was to be fortified as a central pillar of his authority. Unlike the aging leaders of the West, the Comandante was capable of delivering marathon speeches which routinely stretched for 6 hours or more, seldom out of necessity, but as a means of showcasing his apparently inexhaustible stamina and formidable physical vigour. Castro's sexual appetites were no less infamous. Accounts from his bodyguards assert that the former Cuban president slept with upwards of 35,000 women over the course of his lifetime, partners recruited from the beachfronts of Havana. Naturally, such numbers are widely disputed, not to mention the questionable power dynamics at play, but what remains incontrovertible is that El Caudillo boasted a litany of mistresses throughout his 47-year rule, many of whom have attested to his mesmerizing aura and almost ineffable seductiveness. Abroad, this would be condemned as a symptom of moral degeneracy, if not a Caligulan abuse of office. But within the machismo-revering culture of Cuba, it was straightforwardly accepted as another facet of Castro's imperious legend. The tournament was to prove a productive one for the country's new Primer Ministro, and not merely from a PR perspective. Over the course of the weekend-long event, Castro would catch 1 sailfish and 3 Atlantic blue marlin, including a 54-pounder, a haul large enough to earn him a thoroughly unexpected, and indeed exceedingly suspect, first prize. "I am a novice at fishing," he remarked during the award ceremony, allegedly bashful in the presence of the far more experienced angler. "You're a lucky novice," quipped Hemingway, presenting his guest the trophy which he himself had won on 3 consecutive occasions following the tournament's inception. Unsurprisingly, Castro's triumph would be adopted by government-run media in an effort to bolster his salt-of-the-earth credentials, and yet today, well over half a century later, the symbolism of this moment seems more momentous still. Here stood a revolutionary colossus whose power emanated from his dual role as both the voice and vessel of Cuba's collective will, his legacy living on in a society reshaped by his ironclad ideology as well as the relentless machinery of the state. Across from him teetered the now bloated figure of the prototypal American individualist, a chronicler of courage and conflict whose brilliance had been drawn from his self-directed moral code, a code which held, at times even demanded, that a man must carve out his own destiny, separate from the whims of the crowd. In the end, it was a force which was turned inward, often destructively, leaving behind a wealth of canonical novels, but little in the way of tangible, enduring systems. Over the ensuing decades, the men's paths would diverge ever further, culminating in 2 comparably bitter ironies. Not long after their meeting, Hemingway returned to America and his secluded retreat in Ketchum, Idaho, where, on July 2, 1961, he committed suicide, just days after being released from psychiatric care. Castro's demise, and with it the demise of Cuba, was vastly more protracted. His proposed communist utopia failed both socially and politically, the country's economy collapsing in catastrophic fashion with the fall of the Soviet Union. This would lead tens of thousands of Cubans to flee their homeland, primarily to the very nation their self-anointed savior had so viscerally denounced, the United States. It was an exodus which has been replicated in even greater numbers from across the Latin world. So too is it an exodus that has brought the competing masculine archetypes into increasingly uneasy proximity, an incongruity laid bare in spiraling crime rates and ghettoized urban enclaves, cartel violence, and observably deteriorating social cohesion. It is difficult to see where redress will come. As the US stumbles deeper into the technological age, the American man continues to be degraded with ever-mounting hostility, rendered, much like Hemingway in his final years, listless, demoralized and isolated, caught adrift in a culture venomously contemptuous of his virtues. Meanwhile, migrants from Central and South America, overwhelmingly young, disproportionately male, are hampered by none of this belittlement. Instead, they have arrived carrying the still smouldering embers of Castro's ambition, an ambition that was just beginning to take root when the 2 men shared their seemingly inconsequential handshake back in the tumultuous Cuban spring of May 1960. Hi everyone, and thanks an awful lot for watching. If you enjoyed this video, I'd really appreciate if you could give it a like or a share. I can't tell you how much that helps. Well, if you're interested in seeing others like it, please consider hitting the subscribe button. Alternatively, you can always find more of my written work over on Substack, the link for which is in the description. Thanks again for your time.